I used to love the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, named after the theologian and philosopher, But don't let that bother you. I liked it because it was theological and philosophical, but it was also funny. In the strip, Calvin was a young boy, and Hobbes was his stuffed tiger who became real, at least to Calvin. Chet Ramo quotes the strip that I liked. In the first panel, Calvin is alone under the night sky with those stars twinkling down. And if you've ever been under one of those, perhaps you too felt that awe. In the second panel, he screams to the sky, "I'm significant!" In the third one, he's, again, just seeming to be silent, staring into the silent spaces. And then in the fourth panel, he describes how a chastened Calvin adds, "screamed the dust speck." Well, this is significant, I think, for a number of reasons. Here's a physics and astronomy professor writing this great book entitled, "When God is Gone, Everything is Holy, the Making of a Religious Naturalist," and he's using a comic strip to start it off. That's my kind of book. It's an illustration of that feeling I think most of us feel in looking at the night sky if we're outside of the city. Because if you look at the night sky in the middle of the city, you don't see the night sky. You see the city lights reflected onto a darkness. But I think most of us feel some sort of a significance that perhaps borders on religious, depending on your feelings. And wondering perhaps about the creation. And of course, that creator, as I said, the Big Bang, or creation, or how did it all start? Or did it all start? Was there a beginning? And perhaps, who's in charge here? What's my role in all of this? What am I supposed to do when I grow up? When will I grow up? Who am I? Does God exist? I've often said, when someone asks you, do you believe in God? The proper response should always be a rabbinical one. And the rabbinical response is always to ask another question. So when someone says, do you believe in God? Never answer yes or no. Instead, you say, what do you mean by God? Or even better, what do you mean by believe? Or if you really want to stymie them, you say, what do you mean by you? And usually by that time, they walk away very well. I didn't like science in high school or college, and it was a good thing I became a minister. Because you had to memorize in science, and I never liked memorizing unless I was in a play or singing a song. I think I would have liked Chet Ramo. He taught differently. In fact, he even wrote a book called The Path, a 1-mile walk through the universe, about his walk to work through the woods every day for almost 40 years. He was able to walk to work every day. Not only that, he was able to walk to work through the woods every day. Can you imagine? I watched some YouTube videos of his on YouTube, and I have to confess to envy. It shows him coming out of his beautiful Victorian home in Massachusetts, going down the steps, walking down the path, out over the rustic bridge, through the New England woods, to his college. He walked that for 40 years. Through snow, mind you, and stuff. And my guess is he might have driven through the bad snow. But for the most part, he could observe nature as he walked. And I must confess to you, brothers and sisters, I felt envy. I looked at that and I said, that's what I want to do when I grow up. But it was too late. I was a minister, and I never walked to work. After he was married and got his PhD in physics, he decided, he said, to move to New England because of Emerson and Thoreau. It was going to be his Thoreauvian sojourn, he said. And his seeming UU connections were overwhelming, though he never admitted to actually being one. I suspect he is a closet UU. He's more in the company of Catholic mystics. He comes from an admitted Catholic background. They always make the best UUs because they get as far away from Catholicism as possible. And UUism is about as far away as you can get. He talks about the difficulty of science and religion getting along, like with Richard Dawkins, for instance, who says that while he is a militant atheist biologist who he admires for many things, Dawkins sometimes thinks that it is a sham for someone of agnostic temperament to use language of religion, the word God. But Ramos says there is something called natural religion, or if you prefer, religious naturalism, that hides behind and within traditional faiths. And I am not so ready as Dawkins to surrender a venerable and evocative language of praise to traditional theists. I will continue to pray, if by prayer you understand me to mean attention to the world, end quote. Indeed, when someone asks me about my theology, as they often do as a UU minister, because they want to know kind of like where to put me on the shelf of UU ministers, I describe myself as a mystical humanist on the cusp of naturalistic Emersonian theism. And they stop for just a minute, and then they too walk away, and they don't ask me any more questions. But I find myself as being very comfortable being more in the transcendentalist realm of Emerson and Thoreau and those 19th century thinkers. Although I also wrote a sermon once called Why We Sainted Emerson and Why We Shouldn't Have. Because Emerson was not a good church person. He started out as a Unitarian minister and lasted 3 years. Just something to think about. Emerson's first publication was titled Nature. Ramo continues, I will try to live with my Roman Catholic teachers urge me to live in a state of grace, but not supernatural grace, but the natural graces that bless and hallow every day. As he says, he tries to bring the scientists of the past to the present. He said, for Darwin's contemporaries, a single explanation sufficed. God did it. But that wasn't good enough for Darwin, who, of course, as we know, was one of us, a Unitarian. Came from a long line of Unitarian. Even his father-in-law, Josiah Wedgwood, some of whom you might know because you have Wedgwood dishes or pottery, was also a Unitarian. That wasn't good enough for Darwin, who waited 30 years to publish his book, by the way, because he was afraid of killing God or what that might do to other people. So evolution, you see, Unitarian invention. But for those of us who no longer believe in God, then what? He said, I no longer believe in that personal transcendent God of my forebears, and yet I still feel religious. Still enamored of my Catholic sacramental tradition. I still had no time for the miracles or the supernatural, but the more I learned about the natural world, the more I stood in awe of its inscape. I longed to give praise and thanksgiving and to pray. And quotes Mary Oliver, who said, I don't know exactly what a prayer is, but I do know how to pay attention. And he says, I do pay attention. With others of a scientific nature, I read the book of nature. Now in the 8th decade of my life, I am consciously willing to use the G word for the mystery I found there and unembarrassed to use the word prayer for attending with reverence to what I see. He talked about a dinner one evening when the family were discussing why scientists seem so much less likely than the general population to believe in God. According to most polls, about 9 out of 10 Americans say they believe in God. Now, what God they believe in is not asked, but they say they believe in God. I'd like to give them sodium pentothal and then ask them that same question, but that's beside the point. 9 out of 10 Americans still say, yes, I believe in God. But among the American Academy of Scientists, that ratio is exactly reversed. Does that surprise anyone? Well, the group started discussing it. And finally, the daughter's husband posited, only half in jest, you suppose it's because of, quote, overweening hubris, end quote? And we all laughed. Well, yes, there could be some of that. And then someone said, what does overweening hubris actually mean? Well, of course, we had to look it up. So the dictionary, hubris, of course, means setting yourself to be like gods, but overweening was something more difficult, but it meant to be archaic, to be of the opinion, to suppose. Overweening seems to be arrogantly of the opinion, overconfident in one's suppositions. Overweening hubris is redundant, but it's a grand phrase nonetheless. But it sounds a little bit like some you use, I know. None of you, of course. But perhaps you might know a UU or two who the term overweening hubris could apply to. In fact, some of our people who describe themselves as part of the humanists, who are the ones that are the atheist humanists who don't want to use the word God in church. I once had somebody in one of the churches I served actually stand up and say, I don't think we should use the word God in this church. And I said, we're more open-minded than that. I understand your belief, but we have the right to use that. And I said, sometimes I think we're more hubrisist than humanist in this church. And I said, my job as a Unitarian Universalist minister is to convert all the atheists to become agnostic. And I said, that's supposed to be a joke. Atheists are perfectly welcome here. And I said, the idea is to think in terms of exploring all of the options. Don't get hung up on a word. It's hard. Ramo writes, I have given up on the certainty that I know the truth. I no longer believe that necessarily Christians are any closer to God than any other right living people of any other faith. I'm agnostic in that I believe our knowledge is what is partial and tentative. I'm an atheist if by God one means a transcendental person who acts willfully within the creation. I am a pantheist in that I believe in the empirical knowledge of the sensate world as the surest revelation of whatever is worth being called divine, end quote. He is a mystic in that he worships the mystery and feels connected to that oneness. And here is the most important part, given it in value of inspiration. The early Unitarian transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau saw the spirituality in nature. And there are more and more religious naturalists inspiring us with their writings like Annie Dillard, one of my favorites, Ursula Goodenough, Thomas Berry, and many others, starting, of course, with the Unitarian Universalist Rachel Carson. The universe is a unity, an interacting, evolving, genetically related community of beings bound together inseparably in space and time. Our responsibilities to each other and to all creation are implicit in this unity. Each of us is profoundly implicated in the functioning and fate of every other one on the planet, and ultimately even perhaps throughout the universe. One of my colleagues used to say that he spelled God with 2 O's and the devil without the D. Ramo quotes biologist E.O. Wilson. He says, the spirits our ancestors knew intimately first fled the rocks and trees, then the distant mountains. Now they're in the stars where their final extinction is possible, but we cannot live without them. People need a sacred narrative, end quote. Such a narrative can be found, one that is not in conflict with science. The evolutionary epic, retold as poetry, is as intrinsically ennobling as any religious epic, he says. And religious naturalists, okay. It is, you see, all part of that idea that the great mystery, the universe, is a unity, an interacting, evolving, genetically related community, part of an endlessly fructifying tapestry of mutual relationship. Imagine that we are all threads in that, We are all woven together and weaving together. We are still there. We are the weavers and the woven. We are all together. So let me end, since this is the 21st century, of course, with a video of one of my favorite musicians, Peter Mayer, with a song he wrote called Holy Now.